Welcome to Fair Observer Exclusive. I'm Glenn Carle. I'm a retired CIA officer and a senior partner at Fair Observer Intelligence. With me is Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. And together, we constitute the Rajput and the Wasp, and we'll make sense of the world today, or for the month. Our top three issues for February are the Chinese spy balloon, something dear to my heart, and rising geopolitical temperatures, the global energy crisis, and the Adani saga in India, one of the few bright spots, not the saga, but India, in the global economy. And we'll do two things, or try to, with each of these subjects. We'll discuss the facts, of course, which often are harder to discern than others would imagine, and then discuss the ramifications, with all seeking to, everything we say, seeking to address, does this affect global business and the day-to-day concerns of business people around the world? The answer is yes. The concrete ways are hard sometimes to find.
All right. So Chinese spy balloons have been in the news. In fact, we did an article, or rather Christopher Oberschell did an article on the Soviet spy balloon. And of course, the Chinese have been using balloons too. And with the Biden visit to Kyiv, or I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. What's the new pronunciation? And Putin's angry speech thereafter, and Blinken's warning to China about providing smart munitions and other weapons to Russia, which may be going through Iran, as per some already. We have a very heated geopolitical temperature. And so let's get Glenn, a former spy, to talk about Chinese spy balloons. Who better than a spy to talk about spying? Off you go, Glenn.
Or something in the stratosphere. It's hard for all of us to not slide reflexively towards a farcical perspective on this. And it's easy and it's fun, but it's an error, really. This subject of the Chinese spy balloons, the whole drama we've all observed with some amusement and I hope a little consternation, is really the kind of issue that I've spent my career working on, unfortunately in this instance, now brought into the public domain and affecting the relations between the two most important countries in the world. So let's talk about the facts, really, and try to avoid the foolishness, although I will probably indulge myself a little bit. So we know that a balloon floated over the U.S. and was shot down after several days in the public knowledge, just off the east coast of the U.S. And as this was playing out, we know that other balloons were found over Canada and Colombia, each of the one over Colombia apparently of the same kind as that which was the first and eventually was shot down over the east coast of the U.S. And then three other aerial objects were found and shot down in the U.S. too. This immediately increased in tensions between China and the U.S. because the United States said that its airspace had been, as was the case, violated by an object that said was Chinese. And that it was a spy balloon because it had devices to capture emissions and broadcast and so on, and seemed to be under some directional control, which is quite unusual for a balloon. For 2 or 3 days, the Chinese hemmed and hawed, and then they acknowledged paternity, although they said, using one of the hoariest excuses in espionage, that it was an errant weather balloon. I'll talk about the history of that excuse in a moment. And then they started to make counter denunciations. They blamed America for blaming China and being aggressive, a very defensive posture. So why would someone send a balloon, and why do we care? Why is it actually significant? Well, we've learned also in public domain information now in subsequent days to the beginning of the crisis that U.S. intelligence detected this specific balloon, the first one, which is the one that really counts, from its launch site and the moment of launch in Hainan, an island, a large island that's part of China. And they tracked it, the U.S. did, across the Pacific, the Aleutian Islands, Northwest Canada, across the U.S. And then it turns out that it's one balloon in a 7-year-old, at least, program run by the Chinese military, a specific unit or division of the military that is called the Strategic Support Force, which has the mission of collecting electronic intelligence and specifically to develop a balloon force. We also now know, I did not know this before, I've not been a specialist in intelligence balloons, that the Chinese military has been writing publicly in their military publications and so on, professional journals, as it were, that the stratosphere, which is just above where commercial aircraft fly and up to about 100 kilometers above the Earth, is a new domain for the intelligence war and potentially for warfare. And so the Chinese are aggressively working to develop technologies and ways to use this space, but not only the Chinese. We also know from U.S. intelligence reports now that for years, these balloons have been, are being designed for and specifically to float over or fly over the Western Pacific, over Guam or Central Pacific, Guam, Hawaii, U.S. islands, and force dispositions all around the Pacific, a relatively low cost and very useful way to collect intelligence as the still slightly unannounced, but I think what we should all recognize is new Cold War between China and the United States accelerates. So it also, probably also these balloons are designed to provide what in intelligence is called long-range strategic warning. My first job, as I was under training actually in my career, was on a strategic warning desk. And my assignment was to look at a railroad siding in Siberia. It's incredibly boring. But by looking at a railroad siding and knowing the normal traffic patterns, one can anticipate with tremendous accuracy preparations for a major war. A balloon can provide similar kind of warning, which is a useful and I would think an important thing for the Chinese to do to keep tensions low. If they see that we are not planning an attack, that's a major reason why there won't be a response or an attack or aggressive behavior by the Chinese and vice versa. So all of this is not something new, except that the stratosphere is a new domain in the competition between the United States and China, which are the two countries which are, frankly, inevitably going to set the tenor of international relations for the remainder of my life and well beyond. So, okay, those seem to be the facts. Now, why did they do this really? And how could they have done something so blatant? Are they that callous, that aggressive, that stupid? I think here too, my experience, although not with balloons, is directly relevant. Countless times I have lived through what in the CIA we call an intelligence flap. And that means some intelligence operation that has become public or gone wrong in a way that can affect diplomacy in particular and relations between states. This is the last thing any intelligence service, military or civilian, wants to have happen. And so that the cost-benefit analysis that the Chinese made at some level, I think pretty clearly, even from their perspective, was erroneous. Now, why would they do this when all other indications, public moves, and I think government to government have indicated for the past several months that although there is this long-term tension between China and the U.S., there have been efforts specifically by the Chinese and the United States to lessen tensions in recent months. Secretary Blinken's trip was a major step in that regard. This is not to say that they're going to solve problems, but if you can diminish tensions and work on other areas of mutual agreement or interest, then that lessens the chance for war and increases all sorts of other opportunities. The U.S. made the standard response, which was to say, we have to postpone the trip. You can't do this sort of thing to us. Initially, the Chinese made the traditional response in an intelligence issue, which was to say, oh, so sorry. Okay, yes, it is ours. It was a mistake. It's an errant weather balloon. Almost verbatim quoting exactly what the United States said when it was caught in 1960 flying spy planes, the famous U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. Finally, the U.S. had done it for years, and finally the Soviets succeeded in shooting one down just before a summit of President Eisenhower with Chairman Khrushchev. And the U.S. botched the response by getting too embarrassed and at first hemming and hawing, identical to the Chinese, and then saying, oh, so sorry, it was an errant weather plane that lost its navigational abilities. And the summit was canceled. At that point, both parties normally will back off. The perpetrator tends to diminish that kind of activity, at least for a while. And after a cooling off period, relations can return to how the policymakers hope to lead them. In this instance, and here's where it goes from sort of a standard story that has an amusing element because it's a balloon into a failure and alarming failure, I would argue, for China, but alarming for all of us, because the Chinese, in their wolf warrior diplomacy posture, which is to be never concede anything, always to be aggressive on any issue, bilateral or multilateral, that they have a national objective, to the point, being aggressive to the point literally of war, only at which point does one back off. That's not an interpretation, that's the formal policy. And they have pursued this, which I think even they probably would recognize as an error. Now, why would they do this? It seems pretty clear they did not intend to. I cannot prove the following, but the Strategic Support Force had its standing orders to develop a balloon force to conduct intelligence against the principal adversary, the United States, and to be aggressive, to show initiative. These are all fine things. And the commanders did exactly what they were told, except they didn't think in a broader view, which is frankly, frequently military and intelligence agencies do not. And I would wager that the policymakers, Xi Jinping, were blindsided by this and had to scramble. And I would not want to be the commander of the Strategic Support Force now because he has embarrassed the Chinese and created a problem where they wanted to at least lower tensions a little bit. The ramifications are that at least short term, the relations between the two powers have diminished, although happily, we've seen that the meeting went on. Now, it was a very contentious meeting between Blinken and the foreign minister of China, Mr. Wang, but that was anticipated. And I would say the point both, and the objective both for the Chinese and the Americans, is to have some sort of dialogue instead of simply yelling at each other from across the ocean. So there has been a smoothing of events. But one other element, and I think the most important consequence probably, has been why this became a problem. It became a problem because it became public. And once it became public, then the opposition to the leader in the United States, which is the Republican Party, instantaneously seized on this, beat their breasts, denounced the president as weak-wristed, and obliged him really to raise the tensions by shooting the device down. The standard procedure, probably the wiser one, would have been not to say anything in public, to approach the Chinese and say, look, we've caught you. You have to stop this. And the Chinese would say, well, we didn't do anything. And then they would stop this for a time. That's how intelligence flaps are resolved in a way to avoid increasing tensions, which then make life, even for sprocket salesmen in Indonesia, literally harder, which is what has occurred. The domestic opposition in the United States has made this now an issue that Biden has to take, quote, strong measures on. And the Chinese have been caught really in their posture of a wolf warrior aggression. So it's classic, a sad one that could have been avoided.
So if I can interject, Glenn, the Chinese have been caught in their wolf warrior diplomacy mode, and they are now being aggressive almost to the point of war. And speaking of war, Blinken, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, warned China not to sell weapons and smart munitions to Russia. Some people say that's already happening. The Iranian drones coming to Russia are actually Chinese drones, which are rerouted through Iran. Now, if that is the case, then we are seeing a very dangerous ratcheting up of geopolitical temperatures. Combine that, of course, to President Joe Biden's visit to the Ukrainian capital, and we have a real risk of things getting very heated. The pot might start boiling over. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I don't see it boiling over, but certainly it's heated. Not in the future, but the more heated and tense relations become, the more likely an error of consequence is. And so I agree with you that this there's nothing good about this. It would have been better that Blinken and Wang meet without this and yell at each other as they would have. But nonetheless, the meeting would have occurred, and it would have given that much more margin for the United States to press the Chinese not to have arms transfers de facto occurring. And the Chinese would have had more margin not to have to appear strong and to oppose the neo-colonial imperial demands by unfair demands by the power. So I think it has made matters worse and tightened made more restricted the opportunities for de-escalating tensions and avoiding things becoming even worse in Ukraine and anywhere else. Yeah, it's not a farcical event at all.
So the consequences for this, if you are a CEO or if you are a policymaker, if you're a diplomat or if you are a professional, is that the geopolitical risk factor when it comes to planning anything long-term has gone up, which means that it's harder to have stability in long-term planning. And the risk of short-term, or for that matter, big changes accidentally happening have gone up. As Glenn alluded in his analysis, this could have been a narrow interpretation by an overzealous military intelligence officer whose task it is to create a spy balloon force. When you have orders from above to take a very aggressive position, when the only gear you have is the forward gear, you cannot ever get the vehicle into reverse gear, then you are running into risk of any overzealous frigate commander, fighter pilot, intelligence officer, naval commander, military commander, whether on the India-China border or elsewhere, just going overboard that little bit. And so the risk of conflict vis-a-vis China and the risk of escalation of conflict in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia have just gone up. As we can see, the stalemate in Ukraine is very reminiscent of World War I in some ways. Russia has not been able to win, and Russia is bogged down in this conflict, in the cold and the mud. And Ukraine, at the same time, has suffered enormously, both blood and treasure. So we are seeing in this ratcheting up of temperatures in the rhetoric of both sides as such that it is difficult for both sides to take a step back. And the same holds true now for US and China.
I would say that's certainly true from the geostrategic perspective, which is where my life was occupied. But of more direct relevance, unfortunately, to a business person, I would make 2 points. Years ago, when I was in my career, the United States caught a foreign country where I was had some professional involvement, doing something unacceptable, conducting espionage in the United States. And the US caught them and said, cut it out. And I said to my boss, and that happened 2 or 3 times over a period of months. And so I was pleased that the US was standing up, to stop this kind of activity. My boss said, Glenn, don't be so naive, because that's going to make your and my life much worse, because what we have done now by publicizing this is embarrass this country, and they will seek to even the score, even the perceptions. And so we are at much greater risk of being targeted and found out. So that then brings to mind what happened in the Huawei case. The case is pretty open and closed, that Huawei is doing what the United States has accused it of doing, and was serving Chinese intelligence and national security. So that's a good thing to stop. However, by detaining in Canada, as the Canadians did, the wife of the owner, or the
daughter of the owner, yeah.
What happened? The Chinese were caught, yes, but they then immediately, by quote coincidence, unquote, nothing to do with anything, arrested 2 Canadian businessmen who frankly were total innocent pawns in all of this, as chips to even the table and the score. And so I'm not suggesting that it was likely that a business person conducting business in China is going to be detained, but it does make the environment harsher. There's no question, by bringing this public intelligence issue into this intelligence issue into the public space.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.